Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We'll get rolling here in just a few minutes. Give everybody time to hop on. So, dudes, anything fun planned for the weekend?
Not much here, I don't think. Gonna be doing some stuff around the house, and then prepping. My birthday's in a few weeks, something like that. So you gotta do some preparation for that. That's what I'm gonna be doing. I think coming up soon.
Yeah, it's officially birthday month. I almost
It's
forgot.
birthday
Happy
month.
birthday month. Yeah.
I think I may build an arc this weekend. I think it's gonna rain so much here. I might need to start loading up two of every kind.
You look like you're already inside an arc, man.
Yeah, well, it's yeah.
he's already been working on it.
This is a little prep work.
Sure.
Yeah, we had major flooding here in the eastern half of the state over the last few weeks too, and it's pretty gnarly. I'm surprised you guys didn't get hit quite as hard as we did on that one, Pink.
Yeah, no, it's telling you, man. I'm particularly here. We're in this weird pocket where we've got the lake on one side and the mountains on the other side, and it just kind of skips us a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when it hits really hard because it gets down in the valley here, and we're just
Yeah.
it's a problem.
I was going to be rooting on my Cats this weekend, but unfortunately, they made an early ejection from the SEC tournament, and their season is over. So I'll probably just be working on my old boat, getting it ready to hit the water here. Spring is near, and probably sipping some bourbon, maybe some barbecue. Sounds like a fine
Well,
weekend.
that was one thing I wanted to try to. I wanted to do some smoking this weekend for sure. Couldn't decide if I wanted to get like a pork shoulder on or if I wanted to do. We were just talking. I was just talking with Seth yesterday, and he was talking about doing some steaks on the smoker. And I was thinking I might try to get a couple strips, put them on there, get them on the smoker for an hour or so, do a reverse sear on them, and just make a real nice steak
Yeah.
this weekend. So I might.
That's
do that.
exactly what I was going to suggest. I did some ribeyes weekend before last and did the T-Rex method, the reverse sear, and oh man, they're awesome.
I mean, ever since
Well,
I
cool.
started doing it with my steaks, I haven't had a better steak since. So I'm addicted.
I agree. That was the first time I'd ever done it, and it kind of blew my mind. It was the best steak I've made.
Yeah.
All right, well, cool. I think we'll get rolling, guys. So, hey, everybody, thanks for joining us again for the Hackle Box here. Oscar Minks, Director of Technical Solutions for FRSecure. We got Eric and Pinky on as well. You guys want to say hello and introduce yourselves?
Eric, I'm the manager of offensive services here at FRSecure. I recently got a title change there, so yay me.
Yay, Eric.
Yay. And I'm Pinky. I'm the team lead here on the incident response team at FRSecure.
Yeah, I kind of thought about this, how we always just dig right into these and we've never said, hello, here's who I am. So maybe, just mixing things up. It's Friday. Everybody's loose. So, all right, we're going to dig right in. I'm sure that most of you are tuned in are probably thinking about the same thing we're going to talk about. So the big news, obviously, over the last couple of weeks for us has been the Exchange 0 days. Call it Operation Exchange Marauder, Half-NIM, proxy logon, whatever you want to call it. We're going to talk about that today. I know that just looking at the statistics when this hit, we knew it was going to be big. Essentially 270,000-ish servers worldwide were cataloged in Shodan as being publicly available and likely and exploitable at that point. I think the last official statistic I had seen from this was we knew there were around 30,000 American businesses that were impacted. I expect that number is higher now. Everything that we've seen at this point was, if you had an Exchange server online, you were impacted at some point. Right. And so I don't think we've seen anyone at this point that wasn't impacted in some level. I think right now we're tracking a whole ton of cases and helping a lot of folks out here. So I thought we'd first just dig in on what we're seeing and what we're recommending folks do and things like that, as well as kind of dig into each of the vulnerabilities. So we know there were 4 vulnerabilities that were released here, or 4 patches that were released in response to those vulnerabilities. So we'll just go through those first, actually, and then we'll start talking about what we've been seeing and what we request and suggest everybody do. So the first one we'll talk about, and these are not specifically in numerical order, just in the order of my notes here. So the first one is 26857, which is an insecure deserialization vulnerability in the unified messaging service. So I don't know, Eric, if you want to take a minute and explain to folks what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Object deserialization vulnerabilities arise from so in programming and object-oriented programming, you have objects, right? Those objects are typically a collection of data, of parameters or variables, functions, things like that, that kind of will describe how to handle certain types of data, right? So you might have an object associated around a certain type of structure to handle incoming JSON data or whatever it might be, right? So sometimes when you're handling these different objects, you want to instantiate them, you want to recreate them on another end or in another context or in another situation. So what you can do is serialize them, which basically takes an object as it exists in memory and turns it into a string, right? Or some method that's a transferable method of storing that data. And then you can deserialize it, which will turn it back into the object in memory in the code. And so this is something that gets done in a lot of different languages, a lot of different scenarios. The problem is when you allow untrusted user data to submit an object, essentially, right? And so in web applications or in external applications, sometimes it'll be passing around its own objects, but a user can potentially, let's say it's the application sets its own, puts it in a cookie or something like that, and then receives it back from that cookie and then uses it again in the next context, in the next page load or something along those lines, or a header or whatever it might be. If the user is able to modify that header, modify that cookie, modify that source of that object, they can put new data into that object that will then be parsed and processed as it deserializes that object. This in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean that there's a vulnerability that can lead to RCE. Just because you have an object doesn't mean it's something that's actually bad, right? But in some scenarios, you have, so associated in programming with objects is different types of automatic functions that might get called in the creation or destruction of an object. If you've ever even looked at programming, there's constructors and destructors a lot of times in programming languages for objects, right? These things get automatically called when something is constructed, when it's created, and destructed or destroyed. And so if there's a constructor, destructor, or any other type of life cycle automatic function that gets called for this object that works off some of the data that's in that object, you can have a potential flaw that could be exploitable. And in Microsoft, there's several ones that are known in .NET and stuff like that. There's things like Serial.NET project that you can go and you can just kind of automatically create them for certain types of libraries and such that work on certain objects. But basically, it's if you have control over data that's going to be used in one of the lifecycle function calls off of that reconstruction, you can get some exploit sometimes. And so there's very well-known libraries that don't necessarily... it's not necessarily a vulnerability that it works that way, but when you find an application that's letting you put this stuff in and then do that becomes the vulnerability. And that's what was found here is another instance of a user being able to send in some data that could be deserialized and then taking advantage of certain libraries that would allow remote code execution.
Right.
That was a little detailed. If you have any questions, throw them in chat, but yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like .NET does have a history of those deserialization issues as well, so that kind of goes into play here as we thought. And we know in this particular attack, this is just one of the 4 vulnerabilities that's essentially played together, so that our attackers in this case could essentially run code a system, right? So they could access that environment and be able to execute further payloads. So the next one was 26855, and this one, we were just having some pretty good conversation about this, which was in the Ssrf. And I think Eric deals with this daily, or not daily, but pretty regularly, in trying to explain this vulnerability and the function to our clients and why it is a risk. We were just talking about this is going to be fantastic for now in the future. When he's explaining that, we have a real world example of this risk and how it played out. So I don't know, Eric, if you want to talk through that one just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep this one pretty high level, really, this time. And that is that Ssrfs or server-side request forgery is typically it's some kind of method of having the server send a request out on our behalf, right? We do run into this a decent amount, and this is, I believe, on the OWASP top 10 still. It's still in a lot of top 10s. It's out there. It's difficult though when you get this, and we get customers, and we find a flaw of this nature is that. With custom applications, a lot of times we can't just say, well, this exists, so now you can authenticate to this other system or you can do this other thing. It's more of a, well, it exists. We're not sure what that means for you, but it could be not good. And in the case of Microsoft, in this case, in the Exchange and stuff like that, where there's, well-documented systems in place and people can actually mess with this on their own side, is you can go, okay, well, once we have the ability to make this server make requests on our behalf or make requests towards something that we direct, what can we do with that? And in this case, it was authenticate to other internal endpoints, right? And do something malicious with it after the fact. Or I should say bypass authentication essentially by having it automatically authenticate during the request.
Yep. I do see a question in the chat here. Grant asked, how did they patch that type of injection? Probably not going to go into the patch details, but I do have a good synopsis on that patch as well. So if you guys would like to see that, we can send that out in the show notes afterwards. So the other two CVs involved, 065 and 058. One was an arbitrary file route, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, and the other is remote code execution. And so essentially all four of those played together to get us to the current state we're in. So I want to back up a little bit now and kind of start talking about the attack path and what we're seeing in the wild with these cases, right? And so we know that, first we'll start with the timeline. We know there have been reports that this could have started as early as September of 2020. I will say, in all of our research at this point, we haven't discovered anything that was previous to February 26th right now, I think is our initial point of compromise. I'm assuming at this point that likely if that exploit was used previous to 226, it's likely going to be high value targets, right? And that was before that exploit was actually known and the attack kit was released. So most of what we're seeing essentially starts around February the 26th. Again, like I mentioned before, we have seen that everybody that we've researched essentially on this has been affected if you had a publicly available OS server. That date does range a little bit. The earliest ones are early on 226. The latest ones, I think, were around March the 5th. So within, a time frame of just over a week, we saw essentially anyone who had OA available, wasn't patched, were affected by this. They're calling it a spray and pray, right? Which is, pretty typical here for big vulnerabilities get released. The exploit kit's out there, and so the attackers have that exploit kit. They're going to try to touch every endpoint possible to determine who is vulnerable and who is accessible at that point. And we're seeing a lot of that here. So I think that's important too as we kind of step through this attack process. The first thing we're always seeing is essentially a bit of recon, right? So they're running the exploit kit against an OS server to first confirm that they can't exploit the vulnerability. At that point too, in the typical exploit, they are attempting to retrieve the internal FQDN, which is required for the subsequent stages of the attack to be successful. And so when they get the FQDN of your Exchange server or servers, the internal FQDN, this is important, then they're able to launch those secondary and tertiary attacks. Typically what we're seeing in a lot of stuff today is like a drive-by. So some folks will just have, that one connection where the attacker was essentially seeing if that server was vulnerable. Where we're starting to see the attacks formulate though is when we see subsequent connections. And so that first connection takes place, then the second connection happens. And typically what we're seeing in that second connection is an attempt to connect to a mailbox. And so typically after that, the first they validate, they get the name, they get what they need, they go to the second phase. And we're seeing this again almost look like more spray and pray, because in most of the cases they're trying to attach to a mailbox that doesn't exist. And we know too, if attackers do any bit of recon on an organization, they're going to identify mailboxes that are legitimate and be able to attach to those mailboxes. Most of the cases that we have seen to this point though, they're attempting to attach to the mailbox of administrator, which is kind of lucky for us. I think most people, hopefully you guys don't have a mailbox for your administrator account. So we have seen some cases though, where they did do their homework and do their recon, and they were able to identify some potentially valuable mailboxes within an organization, then attach to that mailbox. Once they attach to that mailbox, I think it's important that we all understand what that means, right? So they can harvest any data that would be in that user's mailbox profile. So that'd be all the emails sent, all the emails received, calendar, address book, pretty much anything, right? So if it exists there, they're going to have access to do that. We can say too that the next steps that we're seeing on not all of these cases, but most of these cases, something like 75, 80%, and these are not exact numbers, but is that the third step is deploying a shell file. And so the shell that we're seeing right now is typically an ASPX file. There have been some PHP files that have been observed in the wild. All of the ones we've been looking at have actually been ASPXs though. And this is interesting too. The ASPXs are typically typically, I will say, easy to identify. When you look at those common directories, they're going to be kind of random alphanumeric strings that end in ASPX, right? In one of the more sophisticated cases we did see, though, we did identify the attacker just essentially mimicked a valid ASPX file. So, if the valid file was server proxy ASPX, or they actually renamed that to service proxy.aspx, right? And so it's important you validate those shell files. There are some techniques that we can talk a little bit more about how to detect those as well, but Microsoft does have a host of good information out there that I would, urge everyone to make sure they are familiar with and look at those common directories. We can say that we haven't found shell files at this point that have been outside of the common directories that have been published by Microsoft. So that's a great piece of evidence. But so anyway, kind of going along our path here, the next thing you always want to do if you find those shell files is we want to know if they were used, right? Just like before, we talk about, sure, they validated your server was vulnerable. Maybe they got your internal name, but maybe they didn't do anything further. The same logic exists with those shell files too. Just because the shell file is there, we know there's thousands and thousands of entities that receive those shell files at this point. We want to confirm if the shell files were actually used, right? And so there's a couple ways to do that through forensics. One way is to, if you have good logging enabled, you should be able to see those calls in your IS logs and someone calling that actual shell file. The other artifact that we see is a little more foolproof because we know sometimes logs roll over, sometimes logs aren't available or even set up to log at the appropriate level to see those subcommands, is by seeing if that ASPX file was actually compiled. So if you're not familiar, you can do this through some Mft analysis. Essentially what we'll do is extract the Mft, look at any ASPX files that were created around the attack time, then investigate those, determine if they are malicious. If they are malicious, then we start looking for a compiled version of that file, right? So whenever any ASPX file is accessed through IIS, from my understanding in this attack, we're always seeing a companion compiled file, right? So .NET will place that in its temp folders, compile that, and present that to the user who accesses the file. We're saying again here, not all of our folks that we've seen the shell files on, they were actually utilized at this point. But there is, 50% or more were actually accessed. So that means at that point, the attacker had hands on keyboard on that local system, essentially at a terminal on your Exchange box and running as system. So it's pretty dangerous. When we get there is where things get a little kind of tricky. And so we have to determine what did they do when they had the shell file. And so I don't know, Pinky, I think you had some thoughts on that. If you want to talk through that logic and kind of next steps there.
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is, kind of want to talk about this because this is the part that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, right? I mean, so obviously you want to patch, you want to run these tools, you want to see if these shells were dropped and accessed and everything like that. But so let's say, in the event that you can see the shells were accessed, like Oscar mentioned, through IIS logs or, whatever other logging methods you have there. Obviously make sure the shells are gone up front. Let's try to get rid of those. But keep a track on the names and all that kind of thing so you can reference that later if you need to. But the big part is that this is where we just kind of roll into what I would consider more of our traditional attack path that we see in everything else, right? So it's always the attacker is going to, at this point, look to establish persistence. Then, do some recon, expand your foothold, right? Like Oscar mentioned, you're running a system on an Exchange server. For any of you guys, folks out there that have ran, Exchange servers and Active Directory environments, how tied into AD Exchange is. You're tied into everything and you've got a ton of access there. So tons of credentials to scrape to use for later. That's going to be a big one, right? So if folks, if these attackers can get credentials off these systems, they may come back in later using VPN or remote desktop or, Citrix, whatever other legitimate access systems you have in the environment. And that's going to be a lot harder to track, right? Because if I see that Oscar's logging into our VPN, I'm not that worried about it. So keep that in mind as you're going through these things. If you have been exploited, a password reset is certainly a good call here, and it's going to be painful, but we're probably talking enterprise wide, along with things like curb TGT if they got a, if you suspect that was involved. But beyond that too, right? So talking about expanding foothold and everything, right? A lot of times we're going to see C2 in this, command and control, Cobalt strikes, things like that that are going to get dropped. Trojans, just some way to get back in and some way to establish, further that control after you've patched. And so, if you don't get rid of those shells up front, those are still available. And then if they did use the shells and put in some other type of C2, the attackers still have a path back in. So you're going to want to be looking for that type of thing. And it's a little tricky to start going down the path of how to look for that. It's not exactly easy. There's a reason that it's difficult. But use whatever logging mechanisms you have, whatever detections, your AVs, your EDRs, your PowerShell logging, that kind of thing. Look for, things that look fishy. And really that's the big thing there. And I think, at least for me, and I think probably everyone else, this is the scarier part of this attack. We are always going to worry about them exfiltrating email from a sensitive mailbox, things like that, obviously, but it's this longer term possibility here that worries me a lot in this. So, even if you're patching, even if you're doing everything, make it sure you're staying vigilant to look for everything else and try to find these other attack avenues. Is what I would say.
Yeah.
Oscar, Eric, feel free to jump in.
For sure. And I think that goes in line to, with what we've seen on the cases we worked where they did go to those tertiary techniques. I mean, they had the shell, they were on the box. And what do they do next? And what we've seen is they essentially went to work and trying to deploy the command and control environment in your network. There are detection methods for that. The one thing I will say is they're using PowerShell. I mean, they got the shell and we can see them executing PowerShell commands, which luckily are, going to be logged if you have that logging enabled. So you should have some sort of artifact or residue to be able to retrieve those PowerShell commands and actually see what was going on. I can see too, like in the cases we've looked at, their common persistence mechanism at this point is just a scheduled task. Pretty simple, but effective. The one we've looked at, kind of masquerades as a legitimate scheduled task, which is a typical technique used, right? I think like WinNet has been common. So audit your scheduled tasks as well. Make sure that, if there has been any newly created scheduled tasks on that system, your Exchange box, it's valid, you know what it is. And if it's not, take a deeper look into that and you'll probably be able to figure out what's going on there. I will say that, for folks who have Exchange and maybe you're wondering like, what do I do today? Well, I hope you're patched. If you haven't patched yet, like just go hang up from the call right now and go patch your boxes. Do that right away. What we're suggesting to people though, and run these IOC checks, right? Like there's a host of knowledge that Microsoft has put out there and it's good knowledge about how to check for IOCs. Check for those IOCs as well. And if you're not patched right now, you're going to see IOCs. I'm sure of that. And so if you do find those, you probably want to investigate further at that point to determine, did they harvest data? Did they deploy those secondary and tertiary tools? And are they in your environment right now? What might they have harvested and so on? But the biggest thing that we're saying is if you see that, isolate that system immediately. I know it's going to cause an outage to your email, but we have to weigh the risks and the rewards, the pros and the cons here, and understand that if you don't isolate that system, you've likely got an attacker that has a backdoor into your network, right? Your backdoor has been unlocked and open, and there's an attacker sitting there, and you're unaware of that. So isolate the system. And our attack method on this is to always, let's find out when that server was impacted first, right? Let's find the initial point of compromise. Let's find that point of compromise, and then let's restore your Exchange system to a previous state. So let's go back before you were owned, ensure that box is safe, restore it. And from what at this point, what we've seen too, the actual database contents of Exchange aren't affected. So you can still restore your emails and all that stuff to get your mail system back current. So roll it back, patch it before you get it back online, and then retain that forensic image or that compromised image for forensic purposes. We know we're still only roughly a week into being able to research this, and things do change. It's possible that in another week, our persistence mechanisms or toolkits have changed or the abuses have changed. And so I think it's going to be an important artifact for you to retain that. Lots of you likely have legal obligations to report if things have happened to the data contained within that server. We know that email is a juicy place for a lot of good private secured information. So make sure you retain that as we go down the road. But the primary thing here is patch those boxes. If you're popped, figure out when they were popped, restore to a date previous to that, forensicate your main box. And now if we find those things like Pinky's talking about, where we identify, there were C2s that were deployed, or they actually just have interactive capability on your box, then we have to start worrying about lateral movement, right? And so that's why that artifact's going to be important. If you just blow it away, maybe they got in your Exchange server, they popped over to another server on that DMZ, deployed their toolkit there. But if your artifact's gone, we're never going to know that. So that's our attack method on this right now. I'm not sure if Eric or Pinky, if you've got any other thoughts or maybe things we missed there.
None here.
Same. I think as well.
So we have a couple questions rolling in.
Yeah. Yeah. So one question here is about IOCs on hybrid systems. Yes, we are seeing on hybrid systems as well that Exchange server was just as vulnerable as one that wouldn't be in a hybrid system. I will say the positive note about that is in a hybrid environment, hopefully you've migrated most of your mailbox to the cloud environment. So if that mailbox was on your on-prem environment, may lower the likelihood of the mailboxes they had access to, but I would still certainly check to see if they accessed any of those mailboxes. But unfortunately, the answer is yes. We're seeing attacks on those hybrid systems as well. And I also see Grant.
To be clear, Oscar, sorry, too. I mean, keep in mind, it's not just the mailboxes at that point, right? It's a hybrid system. Sure. You have that whole avenue of lateral movement, everything there, too. So keep that in mind.
Exactly. Yep, for sure. And I seen Grant made a note here, about some the Exchange script that's out there to look for IOCs. Those are good. I'll tell you there's a problem with those scripts though, and it's not going to give you the level of data you'll need to actually forensicate this. So if you find those positive indicators that yes, there are suspicious activity, you need to go get those actual events and pull those events out of the logs that Microsoft queried to get that, pull those timestamps specifically, and then correlate the data. So that, I think that is something I kind of brushed over that may be an important point here. So we are seeing, I know a lot of the coverage that we've read about right now has essentially been on ECP has been the target. There are sub functions within Exchange. ECP is one, but we have seen abuse. And OAB is another one that, the OAB virtual directory is being abused. It's actually how they're launching the reverse shell and creating that. But we've also seen IMAPI as well as just the default OA service. So you should be able to identify through the IIS logs which of those services they were actually connecting to. And each of those specific functions within Exchange actually has their own set of logs that are a little more verbose than those IIS logs. So pull those timestamps, correlate them to those sub-function logs, and then you should be able to see exactly what they did while they were exploiting your server. If anybody else has questions too, I should have said this early on. We do want these sessions to be as interactive as possible. So, fire those questions away, which does lead me to a question. I think we'll wrap up on Exchange and then hit a few other points. We're talking about doing like a kind of this format, but do a call-in radio show. Think like a sports show after your game where everybody gets to call in and ask questions, express opinions, or my favorite call-in show, which is Car Talk on NPR. I don't need to do the impression of that show, but the guys got to hear it beforehand. So if that's something that would interest you all, or you would just like to have the ability to, just call us, ask us questions, post questions in our chat or so on, and us maybe focus on a little dialogue with our participants. That's something we're considering for future. So if that's something you would be interested in, type a yes in your box right now. If you think it's dumb, you can say that too. We're not perfect here.
We'll just assume if there's no yes from you that you thought it was dumb.
Yeah.
I think we're all pretty tough. We can handle it. We can handle the disappointment.
Yeah. Fair. All right. So I want to kind of go back in time. I'm sorry. There are two other things I want to talk about really quick here. First, the exploit code was posted on GitHub, and then Microsoft promptly removed it. What's your opinion on this, guys? Because I have an opinion, but I want to hear yours first.
I have a mixed opinion. I think this looks bad for Microsoft, right? Specifically because Microsoft owns GitHub and it gets posted to GitHub and it's about Microsoft and it gets removed. It looks like they're censoring this, right? Plain and simple. It is very standard in the security industry that once something gets patched, that once something makes the news, that POCs will come out and things like that. And so it looks bad for them. There is evidence to show that this isn't the first case, and it's not only Microsoft, right? That this is actually against I think the terms of service or one of those end user contract type things for GitHub in general, and very well might have none of Microsoft's influence at all, right? But it definitely leaves a bad feel. It's a bad taste in general, right? I think when researchers are coming out and trying to post this stuff and educate people on this, and when it gets censored in any way, it can leave a bad taste. And specifically, Microsoft is poorly poised for that because of this, because it affects them, and they own GitHub.
Yep.
I'll say, like, and I totally agree, but just to take the contrarian view of this a little bit, I get it a little bit, at least up front, before the patches were released, because Exchange is so prevalent and it's such a huge issue. I get that. If that was the case, okay. I still don't love it, and now that the patches are out, it should be back up there so that we can be tearing it apart and figuring out ways to fight against it and see exactly what's going on. So that's where I'm at on it.
Clarify my point a little bit too. It's just, was just speaking as how it looks as far as that's concerned. When you look at like the amount of affected systems out there, the impact of this chain of vulnerabilities, I think as security researchers, we have to be really careful about how we approach this. I know that it's very standard to be like, here's a POC, here's what I was able to root through backward, or reverse engineer and come up with a POC for this as fast as possible to get that credit, to get that stuff. But we're also talking about so many systems out there that are still not patched, that are still vulnerable, that are still going to be heavily affected potentially. And I can see the desire to not want this, or to at least slow this a little bit, right? And like I said, this might very well just be a GitHub violation of just, hey, this is an actively exploited thing with many unpatched systems out there. I could see the censorship of it in general. Like I said, it just looks bad for Microsoft right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And too, like, my thought, kind of to be a little contrary, is all those systems that are out there that aren't patched, they're already owned, man. I mean, I'm confident of that. They have already been exploited at this point. And so, personally, like you said, as us as researchers here, I want my hands on that. And so I do feel like it is limiting our ability to continue this research by them taking that back down. But the second point here is there's good news. We got a friend, it's called the Wayback Machine. If you guys have ever heard of it and you want to get that exploit, go poking around on the Wayback Machine. You'll find it there. If you can't find it, shoot me a note and I'll show you how to get it. So, yeah. Also, I have to respond to a comment. First, thanks for the overwhelming yeses. I think we will do that. We'll let you guys know when we want to fire that up. And I seen someone that said first-time caller, long-time listener. Got to give them a hoo-ah. You'll get that if you're in Kentucky.
That person in particular will get that.
Yeah, he got it for sure. All right. So speaking of the Wayback Machine, this feels like it was way back, but it wasn't. It was just like a month ago. And we didn't get a touch on it in our last session, so I wanted to go back in time and look at it again today. The Florida water treatment facility hack. This had kind of broke right when we'd started our last talk, and so we didn't really get to cover it. And I did want to talk through that. Since that has happened, I know here at FRSecure, we've had a pretty significant uptick in people who host SCADA systems and are essentially scared by this news story. And they want to get those SCADA systems pen tested and they want to test security, which is awesome. I think it's great. You should be doing those things. But I did want to kind of deep dive and dissect this so you guys all understand you really don't have to be afraid of this as long as you're doing the right things. And we'll go through it piece by piece. And I made a really dumb joke in my notes here that said hackers more like slackers. You'll see why as we talk through it. Feel free to tell me that was dumb in the chat as well. So the first point, we're going to talk through these one by one, is how they access those SCADA control systems. They access those SCADA control systems using TeamViewer. Let's just start there. And there's a whole bunch of other things to talk about this. But TeamViewer, being installed on critical systems that control essentially water treatment machines. Why is that a bad idea? Pinky, Eric, does anybody want to go?
It feels a little bit too fundamental to go this route, but yeah, I mean, you've got a remote access tool on a critical system that controls something very important that's also often exploited, right? Even outside of this particular scenario, which is I know where you're about to go with this, but yeah, not good.
Yeah, nothing to add to that. I mean, it's just a very basic, I think we see a lot of times in security, when we're talking about security and we run into different, as an attacker in an internal environment or an external environment, I'm looking for ways to gain access to something, right? So the more layers that are in place to prevent that, the better. I mean, obviously, right? Layered security approaches, whether that be segmentation of network subnets, or whether that, and that require different types of jump boxes or other types of authentication, multi-factor authentications, things like that. The more layers, the better. When you just say, we're going to take a remote management tool that's had many flaws, many vulnerabilities in the past, and we're going to throw it directly on the system that affects something, it just tells me you're like, we don't care about any layers of protection. We're just, hopefully it's built-in thing will just be fine. And then that's concerning.
All right, so the next point here, and a lot of this is going to feel like, I think when we talk through this, like, do we really have to go down this path? But we do. It's important here. All of the computers in that SCADA network and that control environment, as well as the team viewer, share the same credentials, same username and password. So don't do that either. Like, don't share accounts. Number one, I think we've talked about this a million times at this point. This is another reason why you don't do that. Don't use privileged accounts for daily work, and like, accounts are free. Why are you guys sharing accounts? The last time I checked, Active Directory isn't charging you per account. So why are you sharing accounts, man? Come on. All right. So this is the big one. The number 3 here. Not only did those systems have TeamViewer, an inherently vulnerable application, not only were they sharing privileged usernames and passwords, the targeted systems were NATed, translated internally directly to the internet, a full IP translation. So meaning that all the services and applications that live on that system were just available to the internet. And so don't do this either, right? It seems pretty obvious, but don't do this. This is a point too. We have seen this with other people, and I wanted to bring this up today because of this. We know that the COVID world forced a shift in how we operate business, and a lot of people that used to be in the office had to go home. And so we've seen a lot of unfortunate mistakes where people deployed remote administration and connectivity solutions for their employees to be able to do their jobs while inadvertently opening up a huge risk into their network. So if you're unsure of how to secure those remote connection protocols and have essentially, a remote workforce, don't take the liberty to do that yourself, because the impact, if you make a mistake, is huge. I mean, we're working with a client, we're just now getting recovered, who was ransomed just because of this. They were doing the right thing, they thought, to keep their business operational, but they opened remote desktop protocol with single factor authentication to a whole slew of systems within their network. And within the matter of a couple of months, that entire network, the workstations and the servers, this is a particularly nasty one where they were all encrypted, they were all ransomed. So again, don't do that, please. You guys have any other don't do that's to add to that, or reasons why?
No, I'm sorry. I got nothing else.
All right. Yeah.
Just don't.
Obviously, don't want everything hosted on a computer to be open to the internet, I think, for plain and simple reasons.
So the next point in this attack was the county that was impacted actually stopped using TeamViewer 6 months prior to the attack. So they were using this as part of their standard process for management. They stopped using it. They probably found another solution. They didn't take the software off the systems. So why is that still there? Again, treat your application inventory just like you would treat a system inventory or a data inventory. I know you guys all have those, right? If you don't, you should. But treat application inventory the same thing. Don't have unused products in your environment. I mean, it's just an unnecessary risk to you and your environment. And someone did note, they were using Windows 7 again, and maybe that's a budgetary restraint. Always try to get rid of those end of life systems, but just one more thing to add to the pile of why this happened. They're saying it was very likely a disgruntled employee. I don't know the reason why that has been said, but I've read that in some reports. Like we talked about before the call, I mean, it could have been a disgruntled employee, but it could have just as easily been any attacker around the world that did the same thing. So I don't know how they got to that. Maybe that's some insider info, but even if it wasn't the disgruntled employee, it would have been someone else at some point, right? So the key there is, like, if you guys have SCADA systems and you're concerned about that, harden that environment just like you would any other typical environment, right? Don't do dumb things. Make sure you're assessing that environment and testing that environment, putting proper controls in that environment to secure it. And then if you have the ability to, test your segmentation to the environment. And that's really a similar approach. Everybody's familiar with PCI, and think about the controls in place for PCI and testing that segmentation. SCADA is a similar approach. If you have those things deployed, test them in the same fashion. People ask me a lot, well, I want to know if my SCADA system itself is vulnerable. And my gut reaction is, yeah, it's going to be vulnerable. A lot of those SCADA systems are built upon legacy OSs and applications that we know are vulnerable. We also know that those systems, not only are they vulnerable, like they're susceptible to tipping over. So even if there was no inherent vulnerability that they can manipulate what the SCADA systems are doing, they can knock them offline. Pretty simple. So how do we protect that? We keep people from getting access to those systems. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. And I know, Pinky, you had mentioned too, like this kind of remind you of Stuxnet a little bit, just because of the methodologies. But if we dissect this right, Stuxnet was a pretty sophisticated attack by a real hacker. This was kind of a similar story, I think, that people reacted to, but it was just executed probably by some slacker.
Yeah, absolutely. This was it was very different in the way it happened. It was interesting to see, that type of an attack, but no, very, very different in how how it came in and everything as well. So,
yeah, I don't know, Eric, you got any other thoughts to add to that one before we move on?
No, just I mean, I think just in the subject of SCADA and similarly like IoT and stuff, right? Devices in general and things like that. A lot of these things have a development process around them that is driven by different types of requirements to not make too much changes to some of the things. So sometimes you'll see things that maybe weren't designed originally with security in mind, and then they continue down that route because changing the code base or changing the way something's handled, changing the interaction with something is so detrimental, either because of all the things that rely on them or because of just general whether it be clearances or other types of things that are applied to these types of things. You can't change them. And so we get these things sometimes that are just extremely dated in their security measures. So you oftentimes have to rely on the segmentation of these sorts of things and closing off, not natting things out to the internet, not doing things like that. You got to make sure that things are as locked down as possible, because a lot of times the security isn't built into the way certain things work in general, or not as often, not as much,
Yep. Cool. All right. So moving on, we got a couple other quick hits that we're going to try to get through today. So there was a story that broke a couple days ago. I guess it was a couple days ago. The last week feels like it could have been months and one day at the same time. So, but security startup Verkada or Verkada, we're not actually sure of how you pronounce it. You say potato, I say potato. But anyway, Verkada hack exposes 150,000 security cameras in Tesla factories, jails. I think Cloudflare was affected, schools, hospitals, warehouses. Pretty much if you had these cameras, it was likely that your camera feed was exposed. So we've seen that the attackers were able to access that feed. They also were able to access any archive video that you were storing as well. So the interesting thing, and this is the APT that's behind this attack, is APT 69420 arson cats. And from what we have learned about this attack so far is that they apparently discovered this is again, kind of, we don't know for sure, but they said they discovered the credentials online somewhere in public forum. That's iffy if that happened or not. I mean, could have been, gathered through standard attack methodologies as well. We're not sure of that. But what's more scary about this too is that we learned that not only did that account give the attackers access into those camera systems, but also worked within Verkada's internal infrastructure as well. So it was a power user account that was used within that environment. So we know that
reuse, it seemed like,
Yeah, and I think, Eric, you were saying there were some reports too that like even interns had access to these shared power users.
Yeah, there was some, anonymous ex-employees talking to news. I don't know how legitimate the claims are, but just saying that basically super user access to these cameras was a very common thing. I saw some notes, you know, in some of these articles talking about how they said that basically the system would ask why they wanted access to it, but you could just put anything in the box and no one ever audited that log, that information to see why people were doing stuff or if they should have been doing stuff. So it sounds like just generally maybe the practice and the amount of access to those might have been very common. So my question kind of was, did they find an overall credential set that was used by the company, or did they just password stuff some employee who happened to have the, you know, I wasn't sure. Looking through all the articles, it seems like everybody's just kind of regurgitating the same information, getting down to the details of actually where that credential was found. It's difficult. So.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit too about the implications of just those video feeds, right? That's something we don't focus on as much here, but the physical aspects of security and the type of intel that could give an attacker. I mean, you know, if you just think about specifically if you're a high value company with trade secrets, what's that video going to pick up, right? They're going to have a map of your internal environment of your facility. They're going to know where your goods are, right? So they're going to know exactly where your data center is and so on. But they're going to learn a lot too about access to those places, right? So you can determine, you know, what type of access methods are being used within the facility, who has access to those places within the facility. And you think about more sophisticated attacks. If I was targeting Tesla, at that case, I probably got a whole wealth of knowledge now of how I might be able to physically infiltrate Tesla. I don't know. I mean, Eric or Pink, thoughts on that?
I could just say that in some attacks, in some scenarios, you know, multiple different penetration tests we've done, we've gotten access to cameras. And yeah, there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from it, whether we're talking about physical layouts, rotation of security staff, when staff's on site, when they're not, how they lock up at night, how kind of locks are on the doors, what kind of systems they have in place for access to those. You know, you can tell a lot from some of these things. I mean, we've seen Post-its on monitors, probably with passwords and stuff. You know what I mean? Like there's all kinds of things, implications that if you allow other people to see your cameras, what, you know, information they could glean from that.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, any kind of physical attack is always a problem, right? If I've got physical access to the box, I've basically got root on the box. You know, I'm gonna so if I can figure out how to sneak in and get to somewhere and get on a box, then you know that's a big deal.
Yeah, and the other thing that I don't really, and this goes back to kind of principles again, but why did Tesla have those cameras exposed to the internet for logon anyway? I don't understand that, you know. And so I don't know if that was a function of Verkada, that Verkada required that. Maybe they were doing some kind of monitored service in conjunction with those cameras. I'm not sure. But even in that case, you would think if you are doing a monitored camera service, you're only going to permit those IPs from Verkada to be able to access the cameras. So again, it goes back to a lot of the same things we've talked about before, that even if those vulnerable cameras have been deployed within your environment, if you'd protected access to that administration, you probably would have never been impacted by this to begin with. So do the basics.
I think the way it's set up, from what I was reading, what my just assumption was, is it's set up along the lines of Verkada's servers being kind of the go-to, the proxy into that data, right? You know, similar to something like a LogMeIn works or whatever, right? Sure. All your systems ping out to those, and then it shares the connection to you, right? Or it gives you that that through connection. And so they just had this underlying, you know, account that could get access to everyone's stuff. Which is obviously, I mean, that's, I see these services all the time. We see more and more of these services, more and more of these startups in general that are talking about, you know, hosting a service for you, providing a service for you, and hosting your data. And there's always that concern of, well, who has access to my data, right? Who has access to my cameras? Does every employee or many employees have access to your cameras? And that's what we're seeing here. I think we ask this question a lot when it comes to our emails and stuff nowadays, right? We're going, well, what employees at Gmail, at Google have access to my Gmail account, right? Like, what does that process look like? Who can gain access to that data? What data is there and how do they get it? And we ask that question more and more, but we're not asking it of other types of providers as often yet. And I think this is a great case of that, where we're seeing, you know, obviously a lot of people potentially could access it if it's a shared credential set. And when I say shared credential set, I mean like a password reuse and stuff, right? And also a shared credential level, right? Where several different people have access to this functionality. That's bad.
Yeah, it's vendor risk management, right? And I know we do have some solutions for that, and you know, people should pay attention to that more. I mean, we should have learned that a long time ago from Target, right? I still don't think people give that the attention it does deserve. I think it's an important part of, you know, covering your basics when developing a good security program. So if you're not doing that, talk to us. We can tell you how. And then finally, I just want to throw this one in as a quick hit. So hackers snuck sleeper malware into 30,000 Macs, 30,000 Macs that we know of. Apparently, this is only discovered if you had malware bots installed on the Macintosh. But it's coined Silver Sparrow. They're advertising it in a way that we suspect they're kind of downplaying the seriousness of this at this point. Read multiple articles that at this point said that there was no payload yet. We didn't know what the payload was. Then if you actually read the analysis and what the malware was doing, it had a command and control embedded into the malware. So there's your payload. This was not good. And yeah, just kind of interesting. I know a lot of people tend to think that their Macs are exploit proof. This is, a piece of evidence going against that theory, and we know inherently that that's not true to begin with. So wanted to share that with everyone. Yeah, I'm sure that Eric and Pink, you guys got some thoughts on that, but we all had a good laugh, right, about the no payload.
Yeah, I questioned earlier, we were having a laugh about it before this, was what exactly, how do you determine something's malware if there is no payload? I jokingly said, but I do mean it seriously in that sense, that my keyboard is malware with no payload, right? Like, what is malware with no payload? I'm not even really sure what they were trying to say by that. So yeah, I was a little confused by it. It seemed like it was very highly downplayed, but looks like some form of malware that had the potential to deploy a payload through C2 or something along those lines. And maybe they just weren't seeing, when they said no payload, maybe they're just saying like, well, we didn't see a botnet deployed, or we didn't see, ransomware deployed, or whatever that situation. Nothing had been deployed through that yet, I guess is what they were kind of trying to say.
Yeah. That they had observed anyway. And the thing to me that's scary about that is this is only those that had malware bots installed. So how many others were impacted? We do know one thing I did think was interesting about this is they are targeting Intel and then the M1 chips as well. So there's, both flavors are affected by this. But what scares me is how many weren't observed and what were the actions taken on those.
Yeah, think about SolarWinds, right? How long was SolarWinds vulnerable? When nobody had seen it. So same type of thing with that. I do have to go back to what we were talking about before the call, though, is that I propose we change the name. Even though Silver Sparrow is really cool, I really like Mac Attack. Just fun.
You can't just rename them, man. That's not. Can't do that. That's not how this works.
If we discover one that's a Mac, I propose we call that one Mac Attack.
There you go.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, our internal research project based upon this is Mac Attack. I like that.
I like Big Mac Attack that was just proposed by Grant.
Yeah, but now I'm hungry.
I am hungry. I haven't had a Big Mac in a while. So yeah, I guess you guys didn't know you were tuning into the Hackle Box. Now with more jokes, we'll try to keep that rolling the next time. But I think that's it for the day. We appreciate your time. Hopefully you all got something good out of this. If you have questions based on content that we've talked about, feel free to reach out and we can continue the conversation. And if you identify any of those IOCs as you're working through the stuff we talked about with Exchange today and you need some help, talk to us. We triage everybody for free. In a lot of cases, if you're willing and able, we're going to give you good advice and point you on the path and try to just help you get to that point. But we're here to help you if you need that help. So feel free to reach out. Again, appreciate your time. You guys have a great weekend and we'll see you next month.
Bye, everyone.